Hello and welcome to my review of The Angel Wore Fangs by Sandra Hill. I'm going to assume that a lot of the people clicking on this video were brought here by the viral picture of the back of the book that went around on Instagram and other social media. It was certainly what caused me to pick up this book and read it. So if it was released by the publishers to drum up some interest in the novel, kudos to them, they sold at least one more copy by their efforts. And I kind of hope that the photograph was a marketing ploy, because it would suggest that at least one person involved in this book, from conception to publishing to reading, actually has a brain. So let's deal with the plot. Knut is a 400-pound Viking lord. He's living it up while everyone else starves. Kind of living proof of the old, "You look like you've been in a famine. Well, you look like you caused it" joke that was doing the rounds when I was at school. He's recruited by the Archangel Michael to be a Vangel, a vampire angel, which makes him a Viking vampire angel. The plot then skips forward to the present day, where he's riding a Harley and, in Hill's words, rocking a Ragnar Lothbrok look. He then meets up with his brothers to discuss fighting evil at a big exciting meeting. He then meets Andrea, whose sister has unwittingly joined a cult based on a cowboy ranch, which is apparently a front for ISIS, and off they go to investigate, apparently making Knut a cowboy Viking vampire angel. Fortunately, demons have killed everyone at the ranch, so seeing that they're in danger, Knut transports them back to old Viking times, where they form the sort of romance that would bore the pants off of Mills and probably Boone as well. It also renders half the back of the book moot. There are no cowboys, there's no ISIS, there's no sister, and there's very little actual bravery. In fact, readers might bristle somewhat at Andrea's willing acceptance of domestic duties in the Viking period. As this is a novel that pays only a passing glance at realism as it rides by, one assumes, on some sort of pink unicorn, the idea that this might make it a more accurate portrayal of Viking times is a very difficult one to prove. Basically, this is a tale about how Knut and Andrea form a relationship and try to save some Vikings who are in the middle of a famine. The rest of the book is mostly filler, mostly pointless, but I guess it gives you something more interesting to put on the back of your book. Hill's prose is also littered with pop culture references that become very tiresome and will make most readers question if she has a single original idea of her own. She is exceptionally casual, and her text is littered with passages in brackets like the one here, which are both trite and vapid, almost like the worst cliched Valley girl wrote this for her homework and then was awfully proud of the big red F that the teacher gave her. She also ends lines with things like "go figure" and adds "or something" to the end of descriptive phrases. Yes, the narrative voice through some of these might be argued to be Andrea's and be presented in character, but I would argue that Hill is not clever enough a writer to have done that. Indeed, Andrea's dialogue does not use any of these colloquialisms. There is a language to books. A certain standard of education is required to make your book seem even vaguely professional. It's why 6-year-olds, who have the most vivid imaginations of all of us, rarely top the bestseller lists. But nobody seems to have mentioned any of this to Hill. Her ability is practically zero. Her fight scenes generate no tension and are nothing more than perfunctory. There are only 2 that I recall, and they're both almost identical, as are her romantic scenes. I'm sure somebody with little else to do has counted the number of times she uses the word coconut, peppermint, or tingles. It seems like it must be in the thousands. I bought this book, so she must be able to afford at least a second-hand thesaurus. Hill adopts the literary device of adding a menu at the start of each chapter. It is really difficult to see what Hill's intentions are with this. Knut is a glutton. He describes this as an illness in the same way as other addictions, yet Hill's treatment of this is to write menus of extravagant feasts at the start of each chapter, or have Knut stuff his face at every opportunity while Andrea enables his behaviour. You can either acknowledge it's an addiction and treat it accordingly, or not. Hill, like Knut, wants to have her cake and eat it, and then sit in the corner crying about how they just can't help themselves. It's clear from the back page that Hill has no restraint. You can write a book about Vikings, perhaps even Viking vampires, or even cowboy vampires or angels, but you cannot write a book about Viking vampire cowboy angels. Though, to be honest, Hill doesn't even try. The cowboy angle is jettisoned as soon as she's finished describing Knut's clothes. The vampire aspect is utterly irrelevant. He hungers for actual food, not blood, and the only time it becomes any sort of issue is to spice up his bed sport, as Hill calls it, with Andrea. Their relationship is the only aspect of this book that isn't complete garbage, but it still smells like it's off and ought to be thrown away. Flip through the videos on my channel and you'll find my review of 50 Shades of Grey. And what I say about that book is also true of the relationship here. But 50 Shades is just better. E.L. James writes like a professional. Her problem is that her story and characters are uninteresting. Hill has all of those issues, and she's unprofessional as well. But Hill rather fancies herself as something of a Tolkien, and in the style of The Hobbit, begins to introduce some random poems about halfway through. Except Tolkien wrote The Hobbit for children, and his poetry reflects that, being both lively and fun. These are just awful, betraying a real lack of skill when it comes to both structure and rhyme. She'd been better off throwing in a few cheeky limericks. And yes, a limerick is not authentic to Vikings, but nothing else here is either. From the back page, I had an idea that this would be a tongue-in-cheek comedy, but Hill, when she has a situation that might be funny, she often fluffs her lines and ruins it with mediocre phrasing. Credit where credit is due, the character Gerda, who is a real cliché of the gruff female housekeeper, actually has a couple of lines that raised a chuckle. There is very little conflict here to make things interesting. The plot really is about how Andrea saves the Vikings from famine by making soup. The bad guys are practically non-existent. Certainly nothing like ISIS or terrorists actually appear. The Lucipiers have a couple of meetings, then one, Zeb, is sent to hunt Knut. And that's actually quite difficult to say. But it turns out that Zeb and Knut know each other, so the drama simply never materializes. In fact, Zeb expresses a desire to be a Vangel and then gives himself up to Satan. We're supposed to care enough about him that we'll buy the sequel. Well, not with my money we won't. I cannot recommend this book to anybody. In fact, if you're intrigued by the viral photo and the book's quirky concept, what I recommend is that you go to your local bookshop and try and steal a copy. Hopefully you'll get caught and sent to prison, where I'm sure they'll have a library with books that are actually worth reading. This one is simply a waste of ink.